Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the third day of our conference, and it's beginning with the panel Worlds of Cultural Journals. This is a part of a focal point we're running, and the panelists are all contributors to our focal point. And at this point, I'll hand over to Roman Schmidt, who is our moderator.
I think I have a mic here, don't I? Yeah, warm good morning from my side too. I am surprised to see so many of you at this point of the day. Well, all the better for us and for journal history. I think we will try to do it as conversational as possible to get a smooth start into the Sunday, but we will nonetheless have a small input from us, from the panel, and then maybe engage with you, because I know that there are at least 40 journal histories present in this room, so it would be good to have that as an integral part of our conversation. This morning with me on the panel are Marit Kapla, the editor, one of the editors of Ord&Bild, a very old and well-known cultural journal, not only in Sweden but also within Eurozine, because it has been one of the founding journals of the Eurozine network. Then we have Sally Davison, editor of the British journal Soundings. Very interesting intellectual history of this journal here as well. We will hear a bit more on that very soon. I go to Waldemar Kuligowski on your very right. He is the editor of Czas Kultury, pardon my Polish.
Great.
A Polish, I think you can say left-wing cultural journal, also linked to dissident history in Poland. And Waldemar contributed, like everybody else on the panel, to the focal point we have set up. And if I say we, I mean the working group with the unpronounceable German name you've heard, or most of you have heard about already on Friday, a working group on periodical studies, which I represent, but which also Morten Paul here also on the panel represents. Morten is a fellow historian with a specialization in publishing history and intellectual history, and he will give us a little bit more of a maybe a theoretical or historical input on journal history later on. From my side, and he's also the editor and one of the two authors with Moritz Neufer, who's here in the audience as well, of an article which has been published this morning on the Eurozine website on the journals of the far right and the publishing universe of the conservative revolution, which for understandable and good reasons isn't so present in the audience, but I think we shouldn't forget that the history of cultural journals is not only a journal of the liberal or the left, but there's also a whole universe of conservative or even far-right cultural journals that have been around for a long time. So if you want to know more about that, please do check the website once you have an internet connection again. From my side, I would just propose to all of you on the panel and also in the audience something like a leitmotif under which we could think of journal history. I would like to propose that we suggest cultural journals as actors in their own right. So as active protagonists of intellectual history, and not only as it has been conceived for a long time, especially in research, as somehow a medium that reflects a certain kind of thinking, or that carries texts or discourses or theories, but rather as an actor that shapes journals, shapes theories in several regards, in aesthetic regard, in ideological, in sociological regards. So I would like to invite just everybody contributing also to this panel to look at your journal in this regard. For example, what does a journal do to theory or with theory? How does it interact with the cultural, political, intellectual community? What is the mode of intervention in the public sphere? What is specific about this? And how did this change over time? Yeah, and so one important question here is the journal form. Obviously, journals have a very specific form. We've seen yesterday it's not so easy to pinpoint what a cultural journal actually is, but if we approach it from a historical perspective, we can maybe see that the journal form has been historically linked to a certain idea of Enlightenment deliberation, a certain quest that is linked to the essay as a genre. It has a certain aesthetics that has a lot to do, at least in 20th century, with the modernist avant-garde movements. If you think of how journals work with collage techniques and something else. So one idea could be to ask ourselves what this journal form is today. Could it also be assumed by a blog, by a radio station, a spoken word journal? You know, these kinds of interrogations maybe as an input to meditate while you listen now to 3 specific inputs and specific histories of cultural journals. And we will start with Marit and Ord&Bild.
All right. I hope you can hear me. So I wanted to. There's a lot to say when you have the fortune to be one of the editors. I'm the editor together with Ann Ige, and of a journal who was founded in 1892. So there's a lot to say, but I just want to give some visual examples of how we work with our heritage and legacy of Ord&Bild. And in this first image, you can see what it looks like in our office. It's a cupboard that was ordered by our founder, Carl Wåhlin, around the year of 1900 to store the issues in. And so these are the issues from 1892 and onwards. And there are more if you would have made a panorama around the room. It's called Ord&Bild, and that was because the techniques for printing images, it means words and image, and the technique for printing images in a more cheap way to reproduce them was new at that time. So it was like an innovation to have lots of images in a journal like this. And Carl Wåhlin, he was an art historian. He was working in the National Museum of Art. And first, in the very beginning, the journal was attached to a publishing house. But soon, I think they came to differ. I think the publishing house wanted an impact on the content more than Carl Wåhlin wanted to give them. So he broke out and funded on his own. He found other financiers. And ever since, it's been like an independent foundation, Stiftung, Stiftelse. So, and it still is. With the main asset is this cupboard and all the issues. So, and then, so when we celebrated our 125th anniversary last year. And so this is the anniversary issue. And when you work at Ord&Bild, you know, there have been published a lot of anniversary issues before. This is the 100 anniversary issue, for example. So what do you do? And we write in our, Anne and me, we write in our editorial introduction. It's like standing on the shoulder of giants. And so what do you do? And then we decided to, because the history of the journal has been written before, so we asked, so let me see now, we asked a number of writers to write, they had like a free option, they could write anything they wanted about one decade in the history of the journal. So, and then we also included some archive texts. This is one of them. It's written by a pioneer activist for female right to vote. But yeah, so this is the original. But well, so we include, and we also included a translated poem from the 60s by Sylvia Plath. So we, that's how we did the anniversary issue. And another thing that we do is that we try to digitalize text from our archive. It was an interesting discussion about archives yesterday in the bar camp, and I think that's a very important part of I mean, what the cultural journal is, and it's very rewarding to work with that. And so what we do with this, we call it like digital anniversary library number 1, 2, and more are to follow. But then we ask one person to write an essay about a specific theme, in this case fascism, old and new fascism, and then this person curates like a selection of archive texts, and we ask for rights and we digitalize them. And this is another one about the anniversary, actually. But we also have there's a great thing about Ord&Bild. It's included in a project that is called Project Runeberg. It was founded, I think it came out of Linköping's University, one of the universities in Sweden. And so they have digitalized, scanned and digitalized every year from 1892 until 1947. So those texts you can read online already. So we are mainly working with the undigitalized, so far undigitalized years. And just one last slide. Well, just how to, this summer I walked, I made a walk in a part of Sweden that Ellen Key, who is, this is Ellen Key, she was a writer, also, well, she wrote a text in Ord&Bild published in 1900, where she, in her turn, she walked in the footsteps of a novel by Selma Lagerlöf. So, and then, so I wrote about them and the text on Instagram. So and then it will become a text published in next issue of Ord&Bild. So you can like, it was very fun to play with like an archive text like that. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I think it's useful if we have the presentations first and then one have a common round of questions and discussions here on the panel, and then maybe give it to the audience. I already have at least one question on the archive, because I think indeed this is a very important cue on how to define and also the function of cultural journals. But for now, let's give it to Sally and to Soundings for quite a different project, I assume.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk particularly about Soundings as being one strand in a particular intellectual current, because when we were talking yesterday, that seemed to be the thing that people were interested in. So Soundings was founded only just over 20 years ago in 1995 by Stuart Hall, who I think many of you will know, and Doreen Massey, who I hope also many of you know, perhaps not so well known, but still quite well known in Britain, Michael Rustin. And it was set up as a left journal, but very particularly as part of the New Left tradition, which I think varies from country to country, but in Britain it has a very particular history, which is strongly associated with Stuart Hall, and also the idea of the centrality of culture to politics. So I'm going to talk not just about Soundings, but I'm going to go back a bit further into history, not too far. New Left Review, Stuart Hall was the first editor of, which a lot of people don't realise. The way that started was in 1956, which we all know the significance of that year, I think. So there was an existing independent left journal, which was called the Oxford University Review, which was it was trying to find a space, basically, between social democracy and communism. So trying to find an alternative left space. That's where the idea of New Left in Britain, certainly anyway, came from. And so what happened was there was an amalgamation of dissident communists, of whom, again, you'll probably know Edward Thompson as being probably the most well-known one outside of Britain anyway. And so they came together with this independent left journal to form the New Left Review. And I think what's also interesting about that is that when I was been reading, because of doing this talk about Stuart Hall, talking about the history of the New Left, and he talks about generations, so the generational preoccupations of his generation, which was the younger generation at that time, were very much about post-war capitalism and trying to get a handle on the cultural, trying to understand capitalism culturally, which was a kind of a new thing at that time. Whereas the dissident communists were actually people who tended to have been formed before the Second World War. So they were coming from like a Popular Front, anti-fascist history. So their different generations had different preoccupations, but that kind of dialogue they had together produced something new. And I'm quite interested in talking about how ideas pass from generation to generation, because there's obviously a sense in which there's a body of ideas that do get passed on, but obviously each generational cohort has its own preoccupations. So it's like, how do those ideas get passed on? And the other thing I wanted to say is that I would say that we try and think of our journal, or I do anyway, as it's like, when we had the discussion in the bar camp yesterday, people were talking about whether you defined your readers as supporters and friends, or whether just simply people who wanted to come and read your journal, and there it was. And I think our end of cultural journals is very much people who share a set of ideas and want to participate in a particular set of conversations. But I also found it interesting, the idea that we talked about yesterday, that if you make it too much like that, then you can be quite an exclusive group. So it's how you have that idea of a conversation that has certain preoccupations, but is also an open conversation. So just a couple more points, because I realise we haven't much time. So in terms of journals, so the New Left Review, which some of you may know today, is a very different journal now from what it was when it first started, when Stuart was the editor. And it's much more theoretical, Marxist international journal now, which is part of the New Left tradition, but it's like one part of it. And I would say that Stuart's part is more interesting. So he then went off and thought a lot about culture and politics. And again, many of you will, I think, know about the Birmingham Centre of Contemporary Cultural Studies and the whole, partly Richard Hoggart, but also centrally Stuart, were thinking about culture and sort of inventing the discipline of cultural studies, which in its British initial stages was very much a political project. So although it was about culture, it was thinking about culture in relation to politics. And so, for example, when people talk about identity, cultural politics has to talk about people's identities. That's part of political life. But Stuart didn't write very much. Well, they wrote books. They wrote two very important books, which was The Empire Strikes Back and Policing the Crisis. And they were collaborative books that were multi-authored, kind of a different way of working. Anyway, and then just out of interest, so there was another journal in the late 80s, early mainly in the 80s, Marxism Today, which was actually a Marxist communist journal. But for Stuart, so this is the thing about you don't totally identify with the place where you write. So it was a place where he could write because there weren't other intellectual left journals, but clearly he didn't completely identify with that, but he could find that as a forum where he could write. So he wrote a lot of articles in Marxism Today, and in particular he wrote an article about Thatcherism where he invented the term, or coined the term Thatcherism, which for us in Britain anyway then evolved to mean, we realised it was a more widespread phenomenon, so we then started talking about it as neoliberalism, so that's been a very strong current within our journal. And so Stuart wrote there, and then that ended. And then there was, in 1995, when Tony Blair had been leader of the Labour Party for a couple of years, but not in government, and a lot of people were very concerned about what he might do to the Labour Party, and we were clearly right. But anyway, so it started then to try, and it's called Soundings, because it was the idea of soundings of different sets of ideas. Where are the ideas that we now need to renew the left? And so that's why we were set up. And then, finally, it's my final point. So, and now today, we're trying to think, because again, in Britain there is now an upsurge again in the left, and of young people who are interested in these ideas. So we're now thinking again, because we tend to be older people, Adam is younger for us. But we're older people, so trying to think about how we can now share that and pass on that kind of current of ideas, which doesn't belong to us, but which we've got a role in kind of curating and passing on.
Thank you, Sally. Just the words I've heard so far, the archive, the role of generation, of passing on, the role of collaborative writing, Stuart Hall being one who has paradigmatically worked in collaborations and maybe not through big books out there every 3 years. So that seems something specific about a certain form of cultural journal as well. The idea of a journal as a place to share ideas versus a place that puts out texts for something, for a maximum of readership. So yeah, thank you for this contribution. We will continue with Waldemar and Czas Kultury, and also just for you to know, Waldemar has also contributed a very good article to our focal point on the history of cultural journals in Poland and the link between the political history, the neoliberal turn in Central and Eastern Europe, and what it did to the scene of cultural journals. So just as a hint for a good read on the way back to wherever you live.
Okay, hello everyone. Czas Kultury, or Time of Culture, is a Polish quarterly magazine published since '85. At the very beginning, it was exactly a zine, not yet euro, but zine, with small format, handmade, white and black color, like samizdat, I think. It was published out of censorship, out of control, out of official circulation. Of course, our magazine has changed over this relatively long period. First, it was political and social magazine, then literary and artistic, and now Czas Kultury is a hybrid form of artistic and academic period. Why we have chosen this form? Because our readers are different. There are those who remember old Czas Kultury in literary style. There are those who want to read only academic articles, and there are those who want to read both academic and artistic content. Hybrid form. Each issue includes cover Cover story is a set of academic articles with all academic rigors like double-blind reviews. This year we prepared cover story in topics like education for a peace, like repatriotism, or 68 counterculture. Each issue includes also poems, literature, interviews, essays. I think that it's briefly history. Of course, many details is in for speak. We prepare special number for 100 years of Polish independency. First day of our conference, someone talk about provocation as a tool for being more attractive for readers. This is a cover of this anniversary issue. It seems like a screenshot of video game. You shoot Polish white eagles, exactly like on Polish national flag. Your bullets are Catholic crosses. Of course, it's provocation, but in the issue we write about education for a peace, not about education for a war. Thanks. Now.
Thank you, Waldemar. Do you want to, I don't know if it's a possible endeavor for now, even if you want to do it, but I wonder whether it would be worth, because you've written this article, we can also do it in the second round here on the panel, but I would be very interested if you could briefly summarize a little bit how the Polish scene of cultural journals and this intellectual history actually developed with Czas Kultury in it. But I learned a lot from this article, so I would think it would be beneficial for everybody.
Okay. This article was a challenge for me because I am not a historian. I am not an expert in the cultural journalism. For me, the simplest formula of cultural journalism is what is cultural journalism. Cultural journalism is what we doing. Yeah. Maybe it's not so smart, but very simple. Okay, breakthrough year for the history of Poland and Europe, of course, and for a cultural journal was 89. Earlier we have in socialist states in Eastern Bloc. Earlier we had a censorship, party monopoly, and socialist market rules, and then came political freedom, liberalism, and free market. In the most popular narrative, this year is a miracular year, beginning of transformation and opening of new order, or even, let's say, new world in a term of economic, political, social. However, the reality is not one-dimensional and not simple. New Order was a very good time in Poland for cultural journals without censorship, without total control, but it was also very bad time. I have to start by looking into the past for some important details. In 86, Poland has just 17 officially published socio-cultural or cultural journals with prints run or less than 500,000. This is low figures are linked to the low level of trust in the official media. In this context, the rising popularity of Catholic journals in the 80s appears less surprising. The fact that the most popular of these, Tygodnik Powszechny or Universal Weekly, was published in a print runs of almost 70,000 copies in the time, and all sold seems very credible. But in the 1 year after the beginning of transformation, 51 new titles were published in Poland. In 91, this figure rose to the 61, and in 82 to 68. But in the first decade of the transition or the transformation, over 100 cultural journals also collapsed. Cultural journals opened up new areas for discussion, new areas for thinking about culture, about independence. Cultural journals proved to be particularly important in terms of providing a wide range of education resources. Many of them offered material about new thinking in philosophy, in art, and especially in postmodernism. It was a very popular trend at the time. Editors became recognized agents of the process of cultural modernization and transform Homo Sovieticus, passive, non-educational, into global man, global citizen, let's say. Meanwhile, at the same time, the German Big Four, I think Bertelsmann, Bauer, Springer, and Burda, built up their position very quickly in the market of journal in Poland. But others, including JMS, Scandinavia, Egmont, and Helvetica, was also very successful. The game was transformed into a race to introduce new magazines into the market. Their formats and contents were very similar. Cultural journals did not fit into this storyline. However, because their aim was not just to entertain, and their production costs were not being reduced by copying imported format. That's why I think that the 81 and the transformation was a great time, golden era for cultural journals in Poland, but also bad time.
Okay, thank you, Waldemar. Morten, you have the daunting task to to give us a little input here and there. I'll leave this to you, where you want to maybe say a bit more on from a historic perspective of intellectual history. One can look at these cases and these histories.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and also thanks for the honor to be able to speak on a panel with editors of such great magazines. So I'm not going to try to connect all the dots. I think we can do this in the discussion. Rather, I want to give a bit of a insight into what was our thinking when founding the working group of periodical studies and how this relates to the questions discussed yesterday and today. So just yesterday in the afternoon, my colleague Marit, with whom I wrote this article on right-wing journals, reminded me of a quite intriguing letter the philosopher Walter Benjamin sent to his friend, the communist poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht in 1929 or 30, I'm not quite sure. Maybe a lot of you know this letter, actually. In this letter, Benjamin gave a detailed description of a plan that Brecht and he were developing to produce a journal. This journal was to be titled Krise und Kritik, so Crisis and Critique. And in this letter, there's a very intriguing sentence. Benjamin wrote to Brecht, the aim of the journal is to identify or bring about the crisis by means of critique. So from the letter exchange, but also from other writings of Benjamin at the time, we can gather that the crisis that Benjamin had in mind was the crisis of bourgeois society or bourgeois culture. Now, that might not be the goal of all journal editors to bring about this crisis. And in any case, it's quite a lofty ambition, I think, to produce a journal that can bring about such a crisis. In any case, this journal never saw the light of the day, and in 1933, as all of you know, the National Socialists gained power in Germany. Yet I think, and that's why I'm quite intrigued by this letter, the exchange between Benjamin and Brecht points to the fact that also Roman mentioned in his introduction, that journals are not merely a vessel for content or a kind of sign of the times, but rather that they are a vital organ in their own right, with a proper and specific construction, with their own materiality and with their own specific effects. And also with their own historicity, by which I mean that they have a history, that they are within history, and that they also make history. And I think this observation is what lays at the heart of the working group for periodical studies, which we together founded in, I think, 2017 it was, in Berlin. Since then, this group met 2 times in real life. It also has a mailing list and so on. The working group, I remember when we first started to talk about the idea of forming such a working group at a conference, where there was Roman and other people that are now part of the group. The starting point of this working group was our impression that in all areas of the humanities and social sciences, there was a renewed interest in the journal as a form. So it was an interest that did not regard journals as merely historical sources or reference points or symptoms, but that considered them as social, cultural, political, and also aesthetic actors in their own right. Since then, so since 2017, roughly 50 people have joined the research group, which kind of proved our first impression that there was quite an interest in the humanities going on with journals. At the same time, this interest, at least with me, and maybe this would be something to debate, spurred the suspicion that this renewed interest in journals as a form and as historical objects is also a symptom for change. I guess it has to do with and this is something that we discussed yesterday, and I guess you discussed at meetings before that again and again. It has to do with the huge transformation of culture as printing culture, as it was in the past, through, on the one hand, the digital revolution, but on the other hand, through the neoliberal reorganization of society, which I guess you could say ushered in a crisis of the cultural journal, or at least a crisis of their role and function, leading to a re-evaluation of things we long thought to be self-explanatory or even self-evident or obvious. So things that seem to us as being normal are now up for consideration again. I think one of such self-evident things, for example, might be the idea that cultural journals played a central role for the creation, for the sustainability, and also for the democratization of the public sphere after 1945 and in the former Soviet Union after 1990. And I think this is a story that the contribution by Waldemar that he gave now, but also in his article, complicates already quite a lot. Almost all studies on journals up until now were dedicated, at least studies on journals after 1945, were dedicated to journals that are broadly at least positioned on the left or liberal side of the political spectrum. Yet one of the common characteristics when right now speaking about the current rise of the new or alt-right, at least in Germany, is the prominence of journals within this movement. So this was the starting point for me and Marit to set out to investigate the history of right-wing magazines in the post-war period up until now. This is the article that Roman mentioned at the beginning, which was published today. Sorry, Simon, for giving you such a hard time with copy editing it. And thanks a lot for making it possible to be online today. Well, in the course of this piece, we it was also like a discovery for us, because as Roman said, it's like a kind of foreign world for many of us, this area of right-wing studies, right-wing journals and so on. Now, I don't want to spoil too much of this text, but I want to point towards two findings that we made, which I think might be quite interesting for our discussion today. So the first point, or the first finding we made is that a certain type of magazine, which in academia is generally referred to as little magazine, most of you probably know this term, so that is magazines with a high programmatic approach, with a limited audience, and which in the past were often understood as important instruments for the development of the European avant-gardes and neo-avant-gardes, were of central importance for the survival of networks of National Socialist politicians, thinkers, and journalists in the post-war period up until the 70s, or maybe even up until the 80s. While parties and political groups were regularly forbidden in the wake of the Second World War, the more low-level organizational form of the journal allowed for longevity, which later on could be translated into more sustained political projects with the emergence of new right-wing parties in the 60s and 80s, which weren't forbidden. So this is, I think, quite an interesting point of what magazines also can do, and it actually links quite interestingly to the point that you made about the generational transfer that is enacted via magazines and how it actually is played out. The second finding that I want to mention here, and which might be closely connected, but that's up to debate, to the first one, is that right-wing magazines right now are thriving. They are increasing their print runs. There's new right-wing magazines springing up everywhere. And we believe, at least, or one idea that we had is why that is so, why they are thriving right now, is that it has to do with their acute awareness of the role and function which they have within the current media and political landscape. It has to do with their alliance to movements on the streets and in the parliaments, and more specifically, I think, with their understandings of the mechanisms and workings of a refracted media space. So, coming back to a more general point, if the study of journals has a merit for journal making as well, it might be that it helps us to better understand their specific effects and roles in the past, their progressive potentials, but maybe also their limitations and the exclusions that they themselves enacted. You already mentioned that a certain type of journal can also form exclusiveness and so on, which might be a problem or might be at service of something. And this understanding of their specificity in the past might allow also for a more accurate understanding of their changed position and potential today. In consequence, I think, and I already tried to make this clear yesterday, I think that means that we shouldn't get nostalgic about the bygone era of liberal civil society, the welfare state, and democratic public, because they don't exist anymore in this sense, or simply continue business as usual. Maybe it would rather mean to radicalize one's own critique and rethink the formats and production of journals accordingly. And to mention maybe two successful left-wing attempts at doing so, two recent left-wing examples of doing so, which are both outside of the Eurozine network, not to step on anybody's toes here. I would mention, first of all, and probably of little surprise to all of you, the Jacobin magazine on the one hand. On the other hand, at least I think in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, very well-known blog journal Geschichte der Gegenwart, so history of the present. And I think what makes them successful is the extreme sensitivity to their concrete context, so to the context in which they act. That also means, I think that's an important lesson at least that I took away from it, is that they are not simply translatable into other contexts. So I think a German Jacobin is doomed to fail as much as an American history of the present, at least if you just translate directly the formats. This brings me to my last point. So I'm not sure if today the critique advanced or enacted rather by cultural journals should be a critique that brings about the crisis as Walter Benjamin thought about, or if we need to take more into consideration the dangers that would entail, or if it is simply an overestimation of the possibilities of critique by men who really loved letters quite a lot. But I think at least we should discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you, Morten. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Also from this, I will just retain two ideas I've heard now. Because what we're trying to do here is to build something like a little archive of the journal function ourselves, right? Of aspects of what one can learn from how journals function in concrete, precise situations, and what maybe from there can be generalized for something like journal history. What you too have been pinpointing is the role of cultural journals in moments of transformation and of crisis. Whether, as Benjamin and Brecht sought to advance, bring the crisis about, or whether it is just trying to reflect, to coming to terms, to provide new ideas in moments of cultural transformations, with always the risk of then other players moving in and taking over and maybe sidelining those agents who have put forward the ideas in the first place. But this is to me also, this is a crucial aspect of cultural journals, is their relation to societal transformation and crisis going on. And this is also why the context sensitivity is so important, and why you cannot simply take one editorial model. I mean, how many times has it been tried to bring the New York Review of Books to Europe in the past? And it's always this idea of somehow transferring the successful model that has been successful in a very specific context to another context, and to somehow tweak it here and there, and then hope that it'll work. And as most journal historians will probably agree, it never works, right? There are very few cases where this can work. So there seems to be something peculiar about cultural journals that is very closely linked to the context, the local or the political context in which they are made. And this is a huge problem for a transnational network like we are here, or European journal or European endeavor, because of this this task of how can you scale up, go from there to more diverse and broader publics. Okay, I think this is all for us from now from the panel. We have 30 minutes left. I think this is a good time for everybody to join the conversation and maybe enrich this archive of the culture form. Is there anybody adventurous enough to make a start? Yep.
I don't know how much this would be relevant, but actually it's a direct reference to Kulturi and the way you started, and reference to the name of your zine. Zines were, in the 80s and the 90s, were a big type of, a big format for starting a journal, or starting at least some type of publication that comes from a milieu, which is grassroots, bringing up. And I was wondering now what that format would be now, because we are now in the company of established journals, more or less, of an old form. And while you were talking, I was thinking what the new format of Samizdat would be now, which is not print. And I was actually thinking about YouTubers, which are now, I think, the place where the new ideas are at least disseminated, if not created. And I know that this can sound as blasphemy, comparing YouTubers to intellectual elites of the cultural journalists, but I think that is that's actually the underground space where at least the new formats are discussed, and especially when we talk about alt-right, but also when we talk about new left ideas. So this is off the mainstream. I was wondering if we can think about that space in addition to the digitalization of journals and of the print journals. If we can think of that space also as an addition, or at least as a resource to tap into when discussing ideas and when discussing the digital age. We are all online. Most of us are online. Whether we link to others or not, it's a different question, but we still live in the virtual space. So yeah, I would like a comment on that if you have any.
Thank you for your suggestions. I think it's very important. What I say now, what I would to say, Czas Kultury is not a business project. It's still a social project. Maybe direction to new media, new digital media like YouTube is a good direction. But in Poland, the most popular channel on YouTube are populist, nationalist, and xenophobic channels. It's a post-socialist in post-digital era. It's real now. Maybe it's a challenge to journals like Czas Kultury conquest this new area. Yeah, maybe.
Maybe just a little comment on that, because I also think this is a very interesting phenomenon. And when we started to write this article, like one of our primary questions was, why does the alt-right or the new right have such a high regard for traditional journals when they mainly act in the different media sphere? And what we found out is that the links are very important. The way that I think they really acutely aware of how the different media formats work and what they need from each other. And so, for example, there was a real crisis with the Junge Freiheit, which is a weekly newspaper, when it lost, due to a fight with the editor, its intellectual journal, which was kind of linked to the weekly paper, and they had to found a new one to have also this area of advancing ideas and so on. And so I think it's really interesting to think about how these different areas can be connected, and what role actually traditional journals can play in this environment, which can not just be kind of sucked into the new sphere.
I just want to say something very briefly. There's a really interesting, mainly online but also print journal in Britain called Galdem. I don't know if people have heard of it. It's women of colour producing their own journal for, to give themselves a voice. So in terms of new voices, it's quite an interesting model, because they started off online with online articles and blogs, but they now have a print edition. And really interestingly, in August, the Guardian newspaper, it has a magazine weekend supplement. They gave that to Galdem to curate. And so I just think it's quite interesting that actually people do want to be in print, but what online, it's like an ecology, so that, the different types of media feed into each other. So you can have the situation where new voices are enabled to enter into this more traditional area by the fact they can start off online, So I think that's a really good thing. I recommend that to people to look at. Galdem, it's called.
I think we have understood that. Yeah. We're all gonna, once we have internet again upstairs, we're all gonna Google it. The ecosystem question, of course, the role of how different formats play into each other. And for cultural journals, of course, this poses the question of finding an appropriate, a specific editorial form that would then work as well as the traditional journal form on paper worked for cultural journals in the past. And as I have said in the short introductory remarks, that is, of course, the result of a long learning process of how a journal could do something that, for example, a book cannot do, and the proximity of other genres. Of course, I mean, I was fascinated by this study you mentioned, where exposure of 20 seconds. Where was this? Who said it? Yeah, exactly. How this primes your reception of what comes afterwards. Of course, this is also true for cultural journals. You cannot evaluate an article published in a journal solely on the basis of the article and its contents, but you have to look at the ensemble. I mean, as editors, you all know that this is your daily work of conceiving a journal as an ensemble that consists of different genres. What do you position next to what? You get an article in that you don't agree with, but you think it's important. You will cushion it in a way in between other articles. I mean, this is the daily work of editors. And of course, this works in an entirely different way in the digital sphere. People tend to search and find single articles and do not look at the environment in which they were published. By the way, there have been crises like this. I've written a book on Lettres Internationales. The German Lettres Internationales has once published an interview with Fidel Castro, which was in a dossier. Publishing this interview in a dossier had a completely different meaning from publishing an interview with Fidel Castro as such. Media reception has been solely on this interview with Fidel Castro. There's been a second case which like this more recently in the past. Anyways, of course, this is a crucial point for journals and for journal editors to think about the possible transformation of the strength of the journal form, which is very linked to the print Gutenberg-Galaxis, and how this may be translated into a new ecosystem. George.
I wanted to ask Morten a question. I feel sort of shamefully ignorant about far-right journals, and probably many of us are. But from what you've described, and especially the idea of links, you're describing a kind of almost semi-military gathering of forces, very much consistent with Benjamin's idea of creating the crisis. What I want to know from you, if you could talk briefly, is there anything on the left that parallels that sort of, rather than talking about larger issues like ecology and so on, but left journals that are really rallying people around towards for political action, either in the U.S. or in Europe? I can't think of them.
Maybe just briefly, I think actually, as I mentioned, Jacobin is an attempt at doing so in a certain context, in a context where there was no socialist left visible in the United States. So this is like an example. There's problems with this as well, and that's what I think for me is more important. I think it's actually dangerous I think your description is totally right of the far-right publishing sphere as like a kind of dedicated political project getting in line. And I think actually this is not something, at least in my opinion, that we should try to mimic, because that actually suspends critical dialogue, this suspends the complexity, the dealings with complexities of the world and so on. But still then there is the question, what else do we do? But I think that would be important for me to say, even though it seems quite successful right now what they're doing, I think that's not the model that we should try to mimic, but it's worthy to think about what they're doing and why they're successful. And that's a point that we made very strongly in our article, is to say they are not successful on their own. They need the movements in the streets, they need the parties, and you can see always a spike in the relevance of right-wing journals once such a movement appears. Even though they consider themselves as an avant-garde and as an elite and so on, there would be nothing without the people torching refugee houses and people in the parliament saying this is good. So this is also a question of ecology, I think. And probably that means left-wing journals, it's whatever they try to attempt, it's hard for left-wing journals if there's not a left-wing current in politics and in the world. This is interesting in the British case, where such a current exists right now, and it seems that it leads to a renewed interest also in theoretical debates and so on. You mentioned Monument yesterday when we talked about the situation, but also if you think of platforms like Novara Media, which is online, which has like formats of video and text and so on. So, yeah, basically that.
There had been a question there, and
I have a question for Marit from Ord&Bild. You didn't mention that in last year's anniversary edition, all the articles were written by women. Could you? What was the reason for that? Was it to bring about a crisis in patriarchy, or what was it in the context of history writing about journals that made you decide for that?
Yeah, it was. I think it was maybe a way of pointing to the future. Instead of looking backwards, looking back, because historically, the history of Ord&Bild has been dominated by male editors and writers, even though there has been female writers and editors quite early. And I think also that the people, the founder Carl Wåhlin, he was an editor for 45 years, but he had co-editors who were women. So I think, and that's also something that is, I just want to say this, that whenever you have preconception of an era in Ord&Bild's history, when you look closer, it's more complex. And so even this is more complex. It's not like they were all men making Ord&Bild up until now. But we didn't, we decided to ask very good writers, and yes, they are all women. And so it's a way of it's kind of a vision for the future, maybe. Yeah.
So there are no men in the future?
No, but it's just a little, bit of counterbalance the history. Yeah.
Andrea, c'est d'abord. The mic, where is it? Maybe, I think we are streaming this too, so it would be good if, yeah.
My question would not be so much the political history, it's basically a question to Roman and Morten, but the notion, the cultural journal, and the German notion Literaturzeitschrift, so the literary magazine. I wanted to ask you to develop a little bit about how you, so to say, integrate the question of aesthetics in your research, because I think it was quite astonishing when Marit gave her example what translates easily and what transfers from one generation to the other is art. So I think it comes not without reason that the example you took was Selma Lagerlöf to LNK and then to this new approach with this Instagram project to make this walk and then try to find a new aesthetic form for that also. So if you could develop a little bit more on that, I would be very happy.
Morten? Please try. I think, we could have we didn't have the time yesterday when we discussed the study on the question of the problematic the definition problem of Kulturzeitschrift, cultural journal, and whatever. French, we have revue, which seems to say everything in one word, in a certain way. I think if you ask me, I think there's a better term for the kind of journals that is predominant also in Eurozone than Kulturzeitschrift, and that would be politisch-literarische Zeitschrift in German. That would mean political literary journal. Just saying that there seems to be a constitutional tension at the core of that kind of journal between the political but then not only the literary, but the art, the aesthetical, that kind of question, and so they are a Kulturzeitschrift, and Kulturzeitschrift or cultural journals then I think is a somewhat awkward placeholder term that no one is extremely happy with, or but that just came to represent the genre in a certain way. And of course it makes things very difficult, because if you say Kultur in German, do you mean the arts, or do you mean Kultur as in Humboldt, or the cultural, if you say cultural studies in a German sense, that comes from philologies, it is something very different from the cultural studies in the British sense. So I don't think we are going to resolve this problem, but nonetheless, I think for me at the core is not culture in the sense of the arts, not really culture as a whole way of life either in the sense of cultural studies, but something that would be what was in the post-war era understood under the engagement title, this battle between the autonomy of the arts and culture and cultural production, and the need to link it to societal issues and political transformations. It's not a political, we are not talking about purely political journals either, and this has to do with the aesthetical aspect and with the cultural production being at the core of the selection process that goes on in cultural journals as well.
Yeah. Would this also apply for the old right, new right?
Yes, I think it totally would. I mean, just briefly picking up on the question of aesthetics from a research perspective, I think what's interesting is that the journals we are dealing with have their own aesthetic as objects, as printed matter, and they deal with questions of aesthetics. So there's a double self-reflexivity in a certain way, I would say, in almost all of those journals, which I think is quite interesting. So they reflect on their own form by talking about aesthetics, but by also enacting a certain form of aesthetics through the journal. And what I think we in all our meetings always discuss is, and this is very closely linked to the question of the digital archive, is when we research magazines, what are the aspects that we should look at? Can we look at like just the most important texts? Roman already made a strong commitment to say, no, we can't look at isolated important texts. We need to look at the whole printed matter, which, as you can imagine, once digitalization of archives kicks in, becomes difficult. So I think these are very pertinent questions which I think is very important to keep in mind when thinking about journals. And
I see two.
Hi, Andreas Engström. Positionen in Berlin, Zeitschrift, about contemporary music. I'm Swedish, Scandinavian, so I don't really have a question. It's more a thought which might seem a little bit naive, because I think that this discussion about the problematic of defining a culture journal is, for me, completely irrelevant and not a problem at all. Of course, you could divide between culture journal and literary journal the way you just did. But I... in the Scandinavian context, this is not really a problem, and and I was also surprised to hear yesterday the mentioning of minority journals, how to, or if they should be included or approached by Eurozine, and I don't understand why this is even a question. Aren't they already, but they are not here, or they are not here, and isn't this just part of? I wouldn't even like to call it minority. If they're a literary journal or a music journal and they are made by minority community or in another language. It's just a culture journal. I would also like to ask you, Germans, and maybe other Germans as well, when I looked at the Tamara's chart yesterday on the culture journals, the Scandinavians seem fine. I mean, many are there. Well, I think most. When I see the German, it looks like just ridiculous to me. You have 69 journals in Germany, and I could immediately see that there are 8, 3 major, so to say, and 5 minor contemporary music journals, and they are not there. There are a couple of major theater journals, they are not there. And of course, these 69 could very well be a good representation of how a culture journal works. But my question is if this chart is even relevant as a subject of study for culture journal in the major, the largest European Union country. But I would like to ask you Germans and maybe some other Germans here, what do you think, what was your reaction? Have you seen these charts, and what are your ideas about culture journals when you look at these 69 names and the question of minority journals?
I have another idea, because Tamara has raised her hand, and so I would try to escape to answer your question by passing on the mic.
But your comment was extremely important. We perceive ourselves as a liberal, leftist, and open society. But what about minorities, ethnic minorities, for example? Yes, it's extremely important.
Thank you, first of all, for that comment. The main empirical researcher was German and did a lot of work actually in German with German colleagues to get to this list. And we were surprised as well. So I'm really happy. And as I said yesterday, please give us the names that you are missing there. It is not our intention to say this is it. And actually, it's a starting point. So please, if you can give us these references, that would be really good. There was a very specific discussion, or in the case of Germany, indeed, because Kulturzeitschrift is a very different term than cultural journals, as the English term doesn't translate easily. So we found it really difficult. It was interesting. How do you translate it, and what comes up then? And indeed, a number of journals that were included by other countries were not included there. So we used not only web scrapers, but also a lot of the governmental databases. So where they were there, and then you come to translation issues, because then who decides what is in and what is out? So for all countries, if you have knowledge about things that are missing, please either let Eurozine or let us know. The details are, for contact details are there as well. So, but it does raise a broader issue. I raised my hand to ask another question, but it does raise this broader issue indeed. How do we define it, and does it matter? And perhaps the case is different in Scandinavia, as you say. It's not even an issue. Ethnic minority journals are included, or voices are included. That is not the case for all countries, and I do agree that it's something that maybe Eurozine, or in this network, this group of people can look into. For me, the question, and it also comes back to the first question around YouTube. For me, the question that is actually when you presented the panel in the program is, which really got me thinking. So how the cultural form of journals, so what we found in our studies, that the essay is the most used form. It's almost used by, I think it was 88% of the journals. And in the introduction of the panel, it says, well, cultural journals have performed a really important role in shaping how we think, how we argue, how we talk about issues in societies. And I think actually that is really true, because it is a cultural elite that indeed is shaping and not just representing what is going on in society. And I wanted to ask the panel or maybe others here, to what extent do we need to also shake things up in terms of form? I mean, I'm an academic and we ask our students to write essays. And I'm very well aware that that puts students in a very particular direction, in the way in which they think about things, in the way in which they write about things, what is deemed as reasonable and logical. And I couldn't help but wonder, when you talk about YouTube, is there a new form coming up? Is that shaping in a similar way or in a different way the way in which we argue and narrate and make our society? It's a very broad question, but I would really like input on that and any input that people have.
I think with regard to the time we've left, I would just like to collect, and then we have a final comment. And there was a question here, and I think that will have to be it from the side of the questions.
Thank you. My name is Simona. I was born in Slovenia and I lived for 30 years in Barcelona, so I am like one body and two souls, and I have a lot of experience in the field of languages and translating. I'm also with Ola at the PEN International as a chair of Translation and Linguistic Rights Committee, so I will speak a little bit, try to comment on the issue of languages, smaller languages, minority issues and all that. I have to say I was yesterday almost shocked with your report, Tamara, because the question of languages of these journals was absolutely not taken into account. So in Spain, for example, but in your summary, you just spoken about, 50 different journals in Spain, which for me is like saying, what are we doing? All the history, if there is no possibility to make Europeans aware that there are several languages in Spain, and they are not minority languages. They have huge cultural traditions behind of that, and we are sitting here in Europe, and we are not aware of that. And when I compare that with my last trips with PEN International into India, or last year, I made a report for UNESCO about publishing industry in minority languages in Africa. And we are moving forward to go to, to Chiapas next year to speak with Maya people and tell them how to do publishing industry in their languages and their oral tradition. There are really big repression against them. But we are here and we are not able to put this question of languages, which culture is part of it, into one of the central themes. So I'm sorry to be like a bit provocative, but I believe that for Europe, really translation is the language of Europe, like Umberto Eco once said, and this is for a network like Eurozine just fundamental. Thank you.
We have one remark from Philip, one short comment directly, yeah.
If I just may for 1 second. I think we have to be careful to distinguish between, and that's something that we have reflected also in Eurozine over the past months when we did the study, to distinguish between the definition of journal that was used for the study and kind of our internal, the way we perceive cultural journalism in Eurozine, and then again the selection of journals for the network. So these are different things, and there's a good reason why we commissioned the study to a university and left these questions to them. And to get back to what you said, Andreas, Eurozine is the way I see it, and I think my colleagues will confirm that. It's a very open network, open to applications from any kind of cultural journal, and as long as there are, for example, independent from political parties, for example, things like that. When they're independent and interested, they are invited to apply, including Positionen, for example. So there is a great openness, but there is also, I think, an observation that something that didn't come up that much today, the more kind of generalist approach versus the more kind of more specialist or also more political journals that are there. And my impression is that there is kind of a natural reason why many of the journals that are represented in Eurozine have either a more generalist approach, or if they focus on literature, they are also interested in other areas. I think that these journals will seek, more kind of an exchange with other areas. So there's kind of a natural reason, I guess, for that. But this being said, again, absolutely, it's out of question that specialist and music journals and minority journals, we haven't received any applications over the past years from something that you're calling minority journals. So if you know any, please invite them to our conferences. We are very active in that regard. We have, for example, invited all cultural journals in the broadest sense from Austria to this conference. So they were all invited by name, and some of them showed up. Not as many as I had hoped for, but so that's very important for me, and thanks for listening. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Just to respond quickly also to this point, I think, Philip already mentioned it. We have to be careful about on what level we are talking. Are we talking, in that case, we are talking about how to define a term in order to get a quantitative study. And I understand that this is questions of definitions can be boring or a nuisance, but of course we cannot, or at least if we want to do something like a survey of a European field, we cannot escape that question to arrive at the definition that then works to include or exclude empirical data. I mean, this is a very I don't think most of people here, including myself, have a tendency to love that kind of empirical approach, but it is to L-O-V-E, to love. It is, of course, a necessity, and the idea here was that, I mean, our working group is more historically, has a more historical approach, a more qualitative approach. There are people working in media and communication studies who need a little bit of a more strict definition in order to get at data, but that doesn't mean that that is no prejudice for whatever journal will be in Eurozine. So I think we discuss on several levels here, and we have competing demands, and sometimes they can be very one can be very unhappy with the results, because of course if you see that there are, I don't know, 1,200 journals in France compared to 660 in Germany, that's obviously not true, right? So here's obviously a federation of cultural journals in France that defines the term very differently from how the Germans would conceive the term of Kulturzeitschrift. We have to, this is a starting point, and now we have to continue to discuss to arrive at something that is actually a workable discussion to continue on the scientific path. And for a network, it's maybe not so important, because there's a very good day-to-day understanding of what journal fits in and what doesn't. So I don't think one has to fetishize this, but it's good to spend an hour and a half on a Eurozine conference on that question, and that can be it. So in that sense, this is it. We now have lunch, and we can all continue. And there's an announcement from the organizers, I think. From my side, thank you very much for this discussion and your presence on a Sunday morning.
The organizers are thanking both the panelists and Roman for moderating the panel. And of course, we have one more panel coming up in the afternoon, which is about internet technologies and democracy. But before you think of anything further, Sorry, I'm just overstacked with knowledge. I have to put some down here. Thank you. You have all received an evaluation form, and we very much value your feedback. Sorry for the poor puns. It's way too early and way too late for better ones. So we need you to fill out the evaluation form.